Good afternoon, everybody. I want to be talking about the request for repairs. In the purchase agreement, it tells you what the buyer is allowed to do. The buyer, in paragraph 14BE2, up here, it says that buyer may, within the time specified in paragraph 3L3, request that seller make repairs or take other action regarding the property in form request for repair, RR. But look what it says here, and it reemphasizes it again on the RR, or on the request for repair form. It tells us that seller has no obligation to agree to or respond to buyer's request. So this pretty much is saying that if the sellers ignore the buyer, that pretty much is a no answer from the seller. The seller is not going to do the work. And it tells you here in orange, if seller does not agree or does not respond, buyer is not contractually entitled to have the repairs or other requests made and may only cancel based on the contingencies in this agreement. The agreement is capital A, and so capital A means in the purchase contract. If you see little a in the agreement, it's talking about what is agreed upon between buyer and seller in the agreement, that which you are currently reading. And so how is the work supposed to be done? It tells us in paragraph 15, three things. It tells us that it's supposed to be done prior to final verification. It tells us that the work may be performed by the seller or through others. It also tells us that the repair should be performed in a good, skillful manner with materials of quality and appearance comparable to the existing materials. So the seller just can't slap something together and kind of do a halfway job on some work that the buyer is requesting. Now, on the request for repair, in the first part of this, when I get together with the buyer and I ask the buyer, I say, hey, we're going to look at high ticket items and safety issues. And then I might ask the buyer, what is a high ticket item to you? Is $1,000, $500, $5,000? As what do you consider to be a high ticket item? With each buyer, that number might be different as to what might be a high ticket item. The safety issues, the home inspection report will actually address a lot of the safety issues, trip hazards, GFI switches, water heaters not being braced and strapped, smoke detectors not being installed, etc. Okay. Now, at the top part of this form, it tells us that in accordance with the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement, that's what we're requesting, because in paragraph 14, which is what we just went through, which gives the buyer the right to make those requests. It reemphasizes on the request for repair, seller has no obligation to respond to buyer's request. When is the work supposed to be done? Prior to final verification. The buyer could attach a list. How are we supposed to comprise that list or put that list together? I advise you to always put it in a uniform manner. Don't write it up like in a paragraph or a run-on sentence. You want to make sure that you itemize the items. So this way, the listing agent could respond back to on item number 1 or item number 2 or 3 or so on. And they can respond back to what will or what will not be completed. So it makes it very easy to understand. And like I mentioned in the purchase agreement, the seller is allowed to do the work themselves. And so if the buyers don't feel comfy with that, then the seller can say, the buyer could request seller to hire licensed electrician to replace GFI, or seller to hire licensed HVAC, or seller to hire licensed plumber. So this way, the buyer should request the current professionals to do the work on the seller's behalf if they want to avoid any possible unskillful work that the seller might be just putting together. Regarding the pest work, section 1, section 2 would go separate. You wouldn't have to write it up here. You can just check the box and you can name the pest company that actually was doing the work. It says if buyer requests either section 1 or 2 above, seller shall no later, look at this, 5 or blank days prior to the close of escrow, deliver to buyer written pest control certification showing the corrective work has been completed. And now here, if the buyer requests from the seller that they want, we'll say $10,000 in closing cost. If that's what they want, and now the sellers go that they want all this work to be done, then the buyer can go, well, instead of the work being done, how about I just request that the seller credit me the amount that I think it might cost me? So the buyer could even ask for a credit of $3,000. But if the buyers do that, they want to keep in mind that the $10,000 they asked for in closing costs on the purchase contract, this is going to be added to the $10,000. So if the seller accepts the $3,000, that's going to be a total of $13,000 that the seller has agreed to pay the buyer. Because it says in green, Any credit including in this paragraph is separate from and shall not reduce or supersede any other credit in the agreement unless otherwise agreed. And then, as you can see, capital A talking about the purchase contract. It says here that buyer requests that seller modify the purchase price. And now, this is also an option because the reason why this is in there is what I think is because let's say that the $13,000 mark might exceed the amount that the lender needs for the buyer's closing cost. If that happens, you have to put these on two separate forms. You can't say that if the closing cost, if the amount that seller is crediting buyer in closing cost, any additional portion to be automatically applied to the purchase agreement. You can't automatically apply the closing cost to the purchase agreement according to the residential purchase contract. And then you attach all the reports to the request for repair and you provide them to the seller. On the top half, these are requests that the buyer is making. On the bottom half, these would be written down from the buyer's agent that the lender is requesting be completed in order for the buyer to obtain financing, if lender required, okay? And you want to deliver the list of lender required repairs, like we attach a list of the pest or the home inspection or the roof inspection, and you would check the box right there, and you would just add it right there, okay? And then you would, then here, if seller agrees to all buyer's request or some of buyer's request and buyer accepts seller's partial agreement below, buyer removes the investigation property contingency, except the following. So they can check the box, they can go, like accept loan or appraisal or prelims or whatever they want to exclude. And so, or they can check the box here, buyer removes those contingencies identified attached, and then they can add the contingency removal form to it. So the buyer could automatically remove some of their contingency if they feel comfy about their loan or whatever, they can feel that. But I wouldn't, you want to be careful when you start removing these contingencies because oftentimes if the appraiser has conditions of work that needs to be completed, that might fall under the investigation contingency. So I would probably, if there's no reason to remove those contingencies, I probably would do my best to represent the buyer and keep those in place. Buyer proposes the request for repairs which shall be deemed revoked, and then you want to write in the expiration date. Or if you don't write in the expiration date, it says by 5 p.m. on the third day, or I can extend it or shorten it or whatever. If buyer withdraws this request for repair anytime prior to seller's acceptance by communicating withdrawal to seller or seller's agent. So this could expire if the buyer withdraws the request for repair. And how would you withdraw it? Well, you would use another form called a WOO form or a WOO, a withdrawal of offer. Okay, I think that is it. Hopefully this kind of clears up some questions on the first page of the request for repair.